Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today we're diving deep into Stephen Kotkin and Jan Tomáš Gross's Uncivil Society, 1989 and the Implosion of the Communist. Our mission for this deep dive is to really dig into how Eastern Europe in that pivotal year, 1989, ended up completely reshaping the Soviet Union's destiny. And the book, well, it offers a truly surprising, maybe even provocative perspective. It argues the collapse wasn't primarily down to some widespread freedom movement or even just the elites trying to enrich themselves. It's different.
That's right. It's quite a counter-narrative. Kotkin and Gross really highlight a few core themes that, well, they challenge how we usually think about 89. First, there's the absolutely crucial role of Mikhail Gorbachev just unilaterally removing the Soviet backstop, the Brezhnev doctrine.
Okay. Guarantee of intervention.
Exactly. Second, they really expose the deep-seated economic failures, and they use this term, borrow West strategies, which basically created a kind of Ponzi scheme of national debt across the bloc. And finally, maybe the most controversial bit, they focus on the internal paralysis, this real lack of resilience within the ruling communist elites themselves. They call it Uncivil Society. And their argument is that this internal decay, rather than some powerful civil society opposition, was the key factor. It set the stage for what looked like a sudden implosion of these regimes.
Okay, so let's unpack that. For decades, Soviet power seemed absolute, especially with the Brezhnev doctrine hanging over everything. What did that actually mean day to day? How solid was that control before Gorbachev?
Well, it meant the Soviets held the ultimate veto, really, backed by the threat, sometimes implicit, sometimes very explicit, of military force if any country strayed too far from socialism. You had hardliners like Yuri Andropov, the longtime KGB chief. He was key in managing interventions. Hungary 56, Czechoslovakia 68. And he was very tough on Poland when solidarity emerged in 80-81. But here's where the book offers a really interesting insight. Despite that tough public stance, there's evidence Andropov privately, by 1981, was already worried. He felt the Soviet Union was just stretched too thin, couldn't really intervene militarily everywhere anymore. He actually pushed the Polish regime to handle its own crackdown.
Really? Back in 81?
Yeah. So it shows this hidden fragility, this sort of crack in the Soviet resolve, much earlier than maybe we usually think. It wasn't quite the unshakable monolith.
That hidden fragility really sets the scene then, doesn't it? For the big turning point in 1989. Gorbachev's Kremlin doesn't just formally ditch the Brezhnev doctrine. They actively work to stop Eastern Europe's own regimes, these uncivil societies, from using violence. And the amazing thing is, like you said, nobody believed him at first. Not the leaders, not the dissidents, not the West. He was a total wild card.
He really was, and he had the means to enforce it because he controlled the Warsaw Pact command structure, which gave him huge leverage over the national militaries everywhere except perhaps Romania. And he used that power quite deliberately. Think about September 88. An aide tells the French paper Le Monde that Moscow would not be frightened if solidarity reemerged.
Wow, that's a direct signal.
A huge signal. It completely undercut the Polish hardliners and helped pave the way for the roundtable talks that brought solidarity back. Then, fast forward to June 89, right after the Tiananmen Square crackdown in China, Gorbachev ramps up the pressure, explicitly telling Eastern European leaders, no mass repression.
So he's drawing a clear line.
A very clear line. And when solidarity was about to take power in Poland after those June elections, Romania's Ceausescu actually called for other socialist countries to intervene. The Soviets publicly slapped him down. And more than that, the Kremlin congratulated Poland's new non-communist prime minister, Mazowiecki. They even sent the head of the KGB, Krychkov, to Poland to offer public praise. It was extraordinary.
Sending the KGB chief to praise solidarity.
Unthinkable just a short time before. And connecting this to the bigger picture, Moscow essentially letting Eastern Europe go, even if unintentionally at first, immediately put the USSR's own coherence into question. It kicked off a domino effect.
Okay, so Gorbachev makes these moves, the economies are rotting away, but then there's that central irony the book points out. Gorbachev wanted reformers, allies, across the bloc, but he found, as they put it so starkly, no East European Gorbachevs. What does that tell us about these regimes, these uncivil societies?
It tells us they were bankrupt. Not just financially, but ideologically, politically, just hollowed out. Instead of finding reformers, Gorbachev pulling away the Soviet safety net just exposed how badly managed these places were. They'd stuck to anti-capitalism while the West boomed next door. And to avoid hard choices, what did they do? They borrowed huge amounts from the West.
The borrow West strategy.
Exactly, running up massive debts in hard currency. The authors call it a Ponzi scheme situation, needing new loans just to pay off the interest on the old ones. It was completely unsustainable.
So how did that economic mess actually play out on the ground? How did it affect people's lives and force the regime's hands?
Well, let's look at Poland first. The book really emphasizes how different Poland was.
Right, the independent farmers, the powerful Catholic Church, an organized working class.
Exactly. That unique mix allowed Solidarity to emerge this incredible 10 million strong union. Now, it faced repression, obviously, like Jaruzelski's martial law in 81, but it survived. And the church, particularly with the Polish Pope John Paul II and his message, "Be not afraid," that provided a moral anchor, a kind of alternate symbolic universe, as the book puts it.
That's a powerful concept.
It really was. And alongside that, you have the relentless economic pressure, the constant desperate need for more Western loans just to keep things afloat. That's what ultimately forced the Polish regime, the Uncivil Society there, to the negotiating table in 89. And the elections that followed were this huge electoral surprise, almost like a bank run on the whole system. But remarkably, it led to a peaceful handover.
A peaceful bargain, yeah. Okay, let's shift west to East Germany. It had this image, didn't it? Red Prussia. Seemed stable, efficient. The World Bank even ranked its income highly in 1980, above Britain.
Yeah, that image was carefully cultivated, but it was largely a facade. The reality was an economy that just couldn't keep up with West Germany, couldn't compete. And the Stasi, the secret police, I mean, they had files on 6 million people. Over a third of the population.
Incredible.
But all that surveillance gave them no answers to the lure of West German prosperity, this decades-long economic miracle happening right next door. And what's really striking, the book points out this wasn't new. Back in 1961, Walter Ulbricht, the first GDR leader, was basically begging Khrushchev to build the wall.
Begging him.
To wall in East Germans, stop them leaving because West Germany was so attractive economically. Later, Honecker just kept borrowing, pushing the foreign debt up to something like 49 billion Deutschmarks by 89. It wasn't just bad planning. The book argues it was a desperate move by an uncivil society that had no other solutions. They were trapped. Nearly 60% of export income was just servicing that debt.
So a failing economy, total surveillance, but the exit is blocked by the wall. What happens then? How do people react?
Well, not with big organized protests initially. It was more subtle. These peace prayers started in Leipzig St. Nicholas Church, quite small in 82. But by 87, 88, as things were shifting in Moscow, they started growing. Environmentalists joined, people wanting to emigrate. The movement stayed peaceful, disciplined. And interestingly, the Stasi couldn't find any ringleaders. It wasn't structured like that.
How did it work?
It was driven by what the book calls niches, small circles of friends, colleagues, just getting together, complaining, sharing news, supporting each other, mutual aid. These small groups, plus the general quiet discontent, that built pressure. Then came Gorbachev's visit in October 89. He publicly signaled no Soviet tanks would roll, saying, decisions for the GDR are made in Berlin, not Moscow. That, plus Hungary opening its border, allowing East Germans to leave.
That was the breaking point.
It sealed the deal, led directly to the fall of the wall. It shows how even total surveillance couldn't prop up a system rotting from within once the external guarantee was gone.
Okay, now Romania.
Yeah.
The book paints this as the really violent exception. No internal reform wing, power brutally personalized under Ceausescu. Why was it so different?
Yeah, Romania stands out. Ceausescu ran this incredibly harsh regime, crippling austerity measures, which led to terrible conditions like sky-high maternal mortality because of anti-abortion laws. And he demolished huge parts of Bucharest for his gigantic House of the People, megalomania. The book argues this extreme centralization, this personal dictatorship, just left no room for any kind of reform, even from within the elite. Unlike other places, there wasn't really a technocracy to speak of, just this cult of personality and pervasive fear. And here's the crazy part. Romania actually paid off nearly all its foreign debt by March 89. But did Ceausescu ease up?
No.
No. He kept the brutal austerity going. It just shows how detached, how rigid the regime was. The final implosion started small, with protests supporting a Calvinist pastor, Laszlo Tokes, in Timisoara in December 89.
And the violence. You mentioned most deaths happened after Ceausescu fled.
That's the really harrowing part. Over 900 deaths occurred after he left on December 22nd. It was chaos, confusion, mysterious sniper attacks, disinformation everywhere, and the National Salvation Front that took over. The book suggests it was basically the reformed communist wing that Ceausescu's rigid rule had prevented from ever forming properly. They just stepped into the vacuum, a collapse born of fear and inflexibility.
And as you touched on earlier, all this upheaval in Eastern Europe didn't stay contained, did it?
Yeah.
The loss of the bloc sent shockwaves back into the Soviet Union itself.
Absolutely. It directly impacted the USSR. Gorbachev allowing competitive elections at home, plus basically gifting Eastern Europe its freedom, it totally energized the Soviet republics. Look at the Baltic states. They started using things like ecological concerns, Chernobyl fallout, as a kind of safe way to organize and express discontent.
Depoliticized initially.
Right, but they quickly turned that into full-blown movements for independence. And then you see this reinforcement effect. Poland, now safe from Soviet intervention, starts making agreements with republics like Lithuania. They actively supported Ukrainian independence groups like RUK.
So the newly freed states started influencing the Soviet republics.
Exactly. Those internal nation-state structures that the Soviets had actually institutionalized, they suddenly became the key fault lines as Moscow's authority crumbled. The periphery was destabilizing the core. It paved the way for the USSR's own breakup.
Which brings us back to that core argument about uncivil society. The authors are really saying the collapse came from within these regimes, their own failures, their lack of, well, grit.
That's the heart of it. These were dictatorships. Their survival relied on everyone believing they would use force, show their teeth, as the book says.
The perception of strength?
Precisely. Once they hesitated, and Gorbachev made sure they hesitated, it triggered a political run on the system, like a bank run, but political. The monopoly on power just evaporated, almost overnight in some cases.
So what happened to the people in these uncivil societies, the apparatchiks, the functionaries, after the music stopped in '89?
The book suggests three main paths for them. One, largely fired, retired, a sort of bloodless purge that was mostly East Germany. Two, mostly survived in power, which is what happened in Romania with the National Salvation Front. Or three, forced to actually compete with a genuine opposition, like in Poland. And the authors really push back against this idea that there was some highly skilled communist technocracy. They argue that often loyalty was way more important than actual ability in getting and keeping a job in these systems.
Interesting. So competence wasn't necessarily the top requirement.
Which meant that when things got really tough, the internal weakness, maybe the lack of intellectual rigor or adaptability became fatally exposed.
Well, this deep dive into uncivil society certainly forces you to rethink 1989. It wasn't just the triumph of protesters, but this complex, often unintended cave-in, driven by Gorbachev, yes, but also by sheer economic failure and this internal brittleness of the regimes themselves.
It really reframes it, doesn't it? Shows how a system that looked so solid could unravel, not just from the outside, but from its own internal rot, its own contradiction. It's a powerful analysis.
And it leaves you with a final thought, perhaps. There's that line from a Polish worker in the film Man of Iron, "The lie cannot last eternally." This book really makes you ponder how systems, no matter how monolithic they appear, can crumble not just from external hits or heroic resistance, but from deep within, from their own internal flaws, maybe even a loss of self-belief among the rulers. And it makes you wonder, doesn't it? What seemingly stable systems today might have hidden vulnerabilities, susceptible to a similar kind of surprising implosion from the inside out.